Well, good morning. My name is Courtney Yockey, and I am the Executive Director of the Richland County Development Corporation. Thank you all for taking the time to participate in today's webinar offered through the University of Illinois Extension's Local Government Education Program. In partnership with the Richland County Development Corporation, a private-public partnership organization aimed at spurring economic development in Richland County, and the Southeastern Alliance of Illinois, an 8-county regional economic development group comprised of Jasper, Crawford, Lawrence, Wabash, Edwards, Wayne, Clay, and Richland counties. We will be recording today's webinar. To ensure the best quality in our recording, please mute the microphones on your phone and computer, and please keep them muted throughout the presentation. We do, however, encourage you to add questions in the chat box. If you're experiencing any problems, please notify us in the chat box as well. We'll view your comments and questions, and we'll be able to respond or pose the questions to our presenters at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar is on opportunity zones and presented by two experts from the Economic Innovation Group, Catherine Lyons and David Cervantes. Catherine serves as EIG's Manager of Policy and Coalitions. Prior to joining EIG, she was the Southern California's Director for FWD.US, a bipartisan advocacy organization focused on immigration reform. Prior to that, she led the Housing and Community Development Policy work for the Bay Area Council in the San Francisco Bay Area. She served as an AmeriCorps member in New Orleans after graduating magna cum laude from the University of Southern California with dual degrees in print journalism and international relations. She received her Master's of Public Policy from Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy, during which she interned at the DC Department of Small and Local Business Development and the U.S. Senate Committee on the Budget. David contributes to EIG's economic research and policy portfolios. He has diverse experience in economic development and financing, focusing on creating and promoting economic opportunity through SME finance and capacity building. His experience ranges from impact and assessment in an impact investment firm to designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating development projects in the nonprofit and public sectors. Prior to joining EIG, David served as Evaluation and Outreach Manager for the State Small Business Credit Initiative at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. In that role, he managed outreach and oversight of state credit support, lending, and equity investment programs across the country, and was responsible for data collection, program evaluation, and reporting for the initiative. David also worked as a program analyst in the Business and Economic Department for the Pierre Center for Peace and has obtained his master's degree in economic and financing from Johns Hopkins University. Thank you for joining us today. We're very welcome to have David and Catherine to educate us on opportunity zones. And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Courtney, for that introduction, and thank you to you and Nancy for inviting us to be with you all today. It is a pleasure to join you on this fine morning. Like Courtney said, I am David Cervantes. I am a Research and Policy Fellow here at EIG, and I'm joined by my colleague, Catherine Lyons, our Manager of Policy and Coalitions. So today we're just going to give you a general overview of the Opportunity Zones program, go through a little bit of background on the program, it's an overview of the program structure and how it works, and then just get the landscape of how things are looking now and where things are headed. So just jumping into some background, a lot of people ask why opportunity zones and why now? Why does place matter? And this is sort of our go-to answer is looking at the fact that 52 million Americans live in economically distressed communities. And in Illinois, that's 2.5 million, or just about 20% of the population. And this is based on one of our key research products, the Distressed Communities Index, which I would encourage you all to explore on our site at that link at the bottom of that slide. but essentially it's a broad-based assessment of community well-being in the US that's based on 7 different factors, which we will take a look at. And when we jump into these different factors, we really start to see the disparities in the economic reality that communities across the country are facing, with really drastic differences in educational attainment and poverty rates and adults not working, and even things like vacancy and employment and establishment growth. So this is pretty critical. We see it as critical, as a critical issue facing the national economy, and something that was profoundly moving and inspiring to work towards the Investment and Opportunities Act, which ultimately created the Opportunity Zones program. So when you actually, we recently published a report, Escape Velocity, that looks back from 2000 to 2015 at how these different communities have performed in the race for jobs and business growth. And we actually see significant and growing disparity. So the communities at the bottom are actually still in active decline, you will note. And I think one of the key statistics too is just looking at the net change in employment, that there have been 6.8 million new jobs created since 2000. And of that, 6.5 million went just to the top 20% of zip codes. So these are pretty massive economic disparities across place in the country. And those at the top are really performing so well that it distorts the national picture and leaves many of these struggling communities unseen. So working off of that, headline growth statistics are really not reflective of many local narratives, and that's becoming increasingly true with the increasing concentration of growth, particularly in new firm formation. So if we look back at the economy in the 1990s, we see that 125 counties, representing nearly a third of the population of the country, were responsible for half of the national increase in business establishments. But by the 2010s, we see that decrease to only 20 counties with 17% of the population. So that's an extreme concentration of where we are seeing growth. And if we dig in deeper, we see that access to capital is a primary issue for holding back new firm formation and job creation in much of the country. So just some of these top line statistics, we see that community banks have been decreasing significantly since 2008. And in real terms, we know small business lending has remained at a low post-recession. We haven't seen that bounce back. And I think we all are familiar with the extreme concentration of venture capital in particular in California, New York, and Massachusetts. But even beyond that, capital targeted towards distressed communities is also suffers from market gaps, information asymmetries, and other biases. So even 27% of counties in the US didn't receive CDFI funding, and even philanthropy work tends to be concentrated and doesn't often reach some of those most distressed communities in places like Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. So all of those distortions are further exacerbating place-based economic inequality. And that really is the backdrop against which the Opportunity Zones program idea was born.
Yeah, so the Economic Innovation Group has been conducting research like this for quite some time, and that led us to developing a policy solution that we hope will address some of the problems that David just outlined. So EIG actually piloted kind of the idea of this through a white paper by Jared Bernstein and Kevin Hassett. Jared Bernstein was Vice President Biden's economic advisor, and Kevin Hassett is actually now currently the head of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Trump. So it has always been a bipartisan solution at its core. It was initially introduced into Congress as the Investing in Opportunity Act, co-sponsored by Senators Cory Booker and Tim Scott, as well as Representatives T. Berry and Ron Kind, and attracted more than 100 bipartisan co-sponsors. It was eventually made law through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that passed in December 2017. It was slipped in kind of toward the end, but we're really happy that it was signed into law. And basically December 22nd, I believe, when it was signed, essentially kind of was the starting gun for getting this program up and running. And so we've been on a really kind of accelerated timeline to get this implemented ever since. And we'll go into that timeline in more detail later. Thanks. So the Opportunity Zone program is really, its incentive, or rather its intention, is to get about $6.1 trillion in unrealized capital gains off of the sidelines and into these communities that have been typically overlooked by investors in the private market. So those 6.1 trillion are held by both individuals and corporations, and we really think that it's it's a tremendous opportunity for us to get that capital into the communities that need it. Opportunity Zones is also meant to spur longer-term investment. Again, as we go into the incentives of the program, you'll see how it does that. Essentially, the longer you leave your investment in these communities, the better the tax benefit is for the investors. And finally, the one defining aspect of this that makes it a little different from other place-based programs is the fact that it is for equity capital rather than debt. So again, a few things, the Opportunity Zones program really did build off of other place-based programs like the New Markets tax credits, and is designed to essentially complement that, but also improve upon that. And the top three of these characteristics are really the most important. The fact that it is really flexible. There are certainly a few things that every opportunity fund and opportunity zone must have, but it really, beyond that, it is really designed to fit many different types of investment needs for these communities. It is also scalable. This is not a government program, and I think that's really important to note. This is an incentive for a private marketplace to be stood up and for private investment to go into these communities, into these distressed communities. So there is no cap on how much capital this program can move. Really, the sky is the limit. And finally, it is really simple. We heard from from previous programs that it can often get really complicated to implement and to report out on the impacts of the program. And so we tried to make that, we really try to be responsive to those concerns and make this program as simple as possible. And again, kind of the other characteristics are up there on the screen, but essentially, other things to note is that it is designed to help more startups than incumbent firms. And again, it prioritizes and incentivizes that long-term stake in a community's future. So what are the benefits to the investors? So we think about this kind of in three different buckets. The first is a temporary deferral. The second is a reduction in the tax bill, in one's tax bill. And the third is an exemption. So the temporary deferral, if an investor puts capital gains into an opportunity fund, then the taxes on those capital gains would be deferred until 2026. The reduction is basically a step up in basis. So the original amount of the capital gains on which the investor has to pay taxes will be reduced. Again, the longer that an investor holds capital into the fund and into those zones, the more that bill would be reduced. And finally, an exemption. So again, any capital gains on investments made through the Opportunity Fund accrue tax-free as long as the investor holds them for at least 10 years. So you'll see here that the incentives really do prioritize longer-term investments for investors in these zones and these funds. So how does it work in practice? So there are three major kind of components to this. The investments, so opportunity funds make investments in businesses and intangible properties and opportunity zones. So the funds themselves are the only vehicle through which you can make investments into these communities, into these opportunity zones. And finally, opportunity zones are states and territories designated by their governors, and about only 25% of the low-income census tracts in each state or territory were eligible to be designated as opportunity zones through that process.
Sure, let me just jump in really quickly and specify all of those tax incentives are great and true, but they only apply for investments made with capital gains. So that's just another note on the setup of this program, that you have 180 days from the point of sale of an asset to reinvest those capital gains into an opportunity fund. And for those of you who may not be familiar, capital gains would just be, you would take the sale price of whatever asset that is and take out your basis. So put whatever you put into that asset at the front end. And so whatever that difference is would be your capital gain that you could then put into opportunity funds and invest. And funds actually can have mixed funds. So you put in other dollars that are not capital gains into an opportunity fund, but those would not qualify for all of these great incentives, just the investments that are made with capital gains. That was just a point of clarity that came up that hopefully helps make that a little clearer.
Yeah, so as an example, if you were to sell stock and then made money on that stock, essentially that would be the capital gains that you could then put into an opportunity fund and invest in opportunity zones. Then that would be eligible for the tax incentive here. Great. So in terms of investments and what is actually eligible for investment. So the statute really outlined three major areas in which one can invest. And one is stock in a qualified opportunity zone corporation. The second is interest in an opportunity zone partnership. And the third is actually tangible property that is used in a qualified opportunity zone. And when we say qualified opportunity zone, what we mean by that is just a zone that has been designated by the states and certified by the Department of Treasury. That process is actually completed. David will talk a little bit more about what that map of zones looks like. But that is kind of an exciting point of where we are now, is that the zones are designated and we are now in the process of, the exciting kind of point of figuring out how to get investment into these places. So this is where we mentioned that while the program is flexible, there are, of course, certain qualifications, and these are them essentially. So stocks and interests have to be original issue, and substantially all of the tangible property must be located in an opportunity zone. Of course, SIN businesses and financial institutions are among businesses that do not qualify. So essentially, financial institutions can't essentially transfer money from an opportunity fund to another opportunity fund. So again, as we mentioned earlier, this is meant to spur investment in startups and kind of new developments. But that said, there is an opportunity for those for investment to flow to invest or to businesses or developments that are not particularly original use. But if that's the case, then there is a substantial improvement test that applies. So again, what are opportunity funds? So these are truly like the critical vehicles that must be stood up in order for this marketplace to work. The only way that these capital gains can be invested into the opportunity zone communities is through an opportunity fund. The one qualification for opportunity funds is that 90% of their capital in qualified investments in zones must be put into opportunity zones. And that will be audited twice yearly to ensure compliance with that. As David mentioned, you can certainly put other types of capital into your opportunity funds and invest them into the zones, but the only funds that are available for this incentives are capital gains. The private sector and other stakeholders are the ones responsible for establishing opportunity funds. So I think it's important to reiterate that this is not a program that's going to be done by the government. Really, the government's role here was to designate the opportunity zones, and that has been done and done well, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Now comes the opportunity for the private marketplace to come into play. And so they're going to be really the ones that are responsible for setting up these funds and deploying investment through these funds into the zones. The opportunity funds, we've talked to many investors who are looking into starting them up. And I think one characteristic of them is that they have many different types of characteristics. And I think that goes back to the idea that the program should be flexible. So we've heard of some that are planning to invest nationally in zones. There are some that are going to play much more regionally or even locally. Some will have a partnership of many investors, others maybe just a few. Some will specialize in real estate. We've definitely seen a lot of that, but also some are much more interested in investing more in startups and entrepreneurs. Again, some will maybe invest in only one particular project, while others might be more diversified and spread their funding to many other projects throughout a region or even nationally. So again, I think that just goes to show that there's the sky's the limit in terms of what we see as the potential impact here. So Treasury updated their FAQ page recently to indicate that funds will self-certify. So it should be a very simple process to set up a fund and have that certified by Treasury as a legitimate opportunity fund. They're going to be coming out with that form later this summer. And essentially, it's just something you would fill out and attach to your tax return for the corresponding year.
Can I just touch on two things really quickly?
Please,
so
yeah.
On that last point, that's right. I think that's important to highlight is the flexibility of self-certification, and note that even individual taxpayers can self-certify as an opportunity fund. Just to sort of peak that with the point that all investments have to go through an O fund. That's true, but creating an O fund is actually very simple, should be very straightforward. And the other thing I just wanted to note briefly is it is true that the ball is largely in the court of the private sector to create these funds and actually start the flow of investment. But that I don't want to say that there is no role for states and local government to be involved to some degree. I think that that's something that we can potentially talk about more, but there are things that states and local governments can be doing to help connect investors to potential opportunities and deal flow in their areas. And it really will take that sort of public sector leadership for a lot of these areas to see investment, because that is one of the important parts of this, that none of these zones are guaranteed to see that investment. So it really does take, and I know a lot of you are on economic development people on state and local governments, it really will take all of you to circle around this opportunity and make sure that your communities are seen and that investors are connected with potential opportunities there. So there is a role for public sector, but yes, it is largely going to be driven by the private sector, and there is no formal role for public sector. Going off of what Catherine said, that's right. There are no federal dollars, there are no state dollars that are necessarily going into this per the statute. But there are things that public sector can be doing to make sure that it works.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, thank you for clarifying that. And I know that we'll get into that a little bit later on in the presentation about various ways that you all could be thinking about strategizing and attracting investment to your regions. Certainly, the government's work is not done in this. I more meant that from a federal government perspective, and at least from a statutory perspective, kind of the main role was to designate those zones. But this is actually really where not only the private market, but also really the local governments especially have a big role to play. And again, not only setting up the funds, but also really coming up with kind of creative strategies to attract investments to your region and to your cities. So that's a really important caveat. So thank you. Great.
Oh yeah, so this is what the zones actually look like. This is speaking of all the designations being done. So like Catherine mentioned, all of the state governor's offices were responsible for selecting up to 25% of their low-income communities in their state to become opportunity zones, and those were all certified and completed mid-June by Treasury. So we have an active map and we know where these opportunity zones are. So we've had a bit of a chance to dig into some of the statistics to look at what these places actually look like. And I think it's important to note that governors really did a good job, I think, in balancing need and obviously all of these communities are low income, but balancing that with places that actually also have some base to build off of. So there is the potential for investable deal flow to come out of these areas. So just these are the top line statistics, but we see 76% of these zones in metropolitan areas and 24% non-metro. We see that the areas are home to 31.3 million residents in the US. And if you add that to include the territories, that jumps up to 35. And then it is also, like I was saying, a strong foundation with 1.6 million business establishments currently in place and 24 million jobs in these areas. If we look specifically at Illinois, these are just some of the statistics that we can pull. And I want to mention too that EIG is happy to serve as a resource to state and local governments that are interested in exploring their zones. We have a plethora of data that we can pull and provide for all of you. If you are interested, feel free to reach out. But these are some of the top statistics that we pulled for looking at Illinois. You guys have 327 zones, home to 1.2 million people, about 500,000 jobs, 34,000 businesses. And I think that it's always interesting to note on the needs side that we are seeing 41% of adults not working and really high poverty rate at 34%. And median income there again at about 35,000. And if we look as a nod to Courtney for hosting us for this, we took a look at the opportunity zones in Richland County in particular, of which there is just the one, but it isn't only. And this is just again a sort of a closer look at some of the statistics that we can pull on this, looking at what the residents and jobs and businesses makeup looks like, as well as obviously poverty and median income and all of the rest. So we have gone through and tried to identify what we call anchor institutions in a lot of these zones, and we don't have a systematic approach for that at this point, but that is something that we're looking at. We have a few sort of projects in the pipeline to help really illustrate what these areas look like and help illustrate where the potential opportunities might be. But that involves sort of highlighting where there might be downtown areas or business districts, or again, anchor institutions like colleges and universities and other public institutions of the like. But that's just our little overview and nod to Richland County.
Great. So I think, again, the exciting part about opportunity zones is the kind of myriad of use cases that are possible for potential investment in these zones. And so we just wanted to highlight a few. I think it's always really helpful to provide some sort of tangible examples of potential investments, especially as you all seek to start strategizing around, what and how might be eligible for investment in opportunity zones, and more particularly, like, what are the types of investments that would align with some of your economic development plans already. If you already have particular incentives or tax credits that are in place in your regions or even in the state of Illinois, how can opportunity zones really fit nicely in with those incentives that are currently on the books, to ensure that this is a program or this is an initiative that is helping to advance your economic development goals. So, of course, we have startups here, and again, the Opportunity Zones program is particularly geared toward startups and investing in new businesses. There's definitely a real estate component to this. The statute is pretty easy to interpret when it comes to real estate. And so we have a lot of people who are really excited about investing in affordable housing projects in these zones, as well as in commercial developments. At the end of the day, there of course need to be a place for these startups to reside. So that is that's an important piece of the puzzle as well. Just as an example, there's a venture fund that we work with here that is interested in building out incubators and accelerator spaces, as places for a lot of their businesses that they already invest in to actually be housed. So I think that's kind of an interesting, almost hybrid of investing in, a commercial development and real estate, but with the intention of bringing a boost to kind of the startup culture and community in rural counties. Other use cases include innovation districts. I think this is something that like Oklahoma City is doing particularly well. Another example is Tennessee made sure that their enterprise centers, which is again an economic development initiative on their part, were all centered in opportunity zones. So that's great for the entrepreneurs and the startups that are housed there. They will all be able to be eligible for opportunity zone investments, which is great. Brownfield development is another really exciting opportunity here. You know, again, a lot of these places have been sort of left behind by economic development plans, and opportunity zones include many brownfield redevelopment opportunities. So again, these types of places would also be eligible for investment and revitalization. And finally, a lot of the states out west are looking at the possibility of energy assets as an opportunity for these zones, and you know, solar farms and other things like that we have, you know, require kind of a lot of land, and so you'll see places in like Nevada and other states out west that have designated kind of broad swaths of their kind of more rural regions as opportunity zones, and are looking at energy assets as a way to, you know, as a potential investment there. So again, capital alone is not a strategy, and this is where I think David's point to the fact that, you know, you all as local governments and local economic development organizations have a real role to play in this phase of the implementation. And I think, again, kind of getting to the idea of, you know, what, like starting to work together with local stakeholders to figure out what is who are members of the ecosystem that you want to create here, whether that's investors, investees, fund managers, partner organizations, local foundations, etc. You know, also thinking through, you know, what are your economic development plans currently, and how can, again, as I was mentioning before, how can they be advanced by this incentive? And then, you know, what kind of things can you do to help investors see the possibilities in your regions as well? Are there some startups or innovation districts that are currently popping up? You know, how can you really pitch to investors the opportunities that exist in your areas and the opportunity zones that are designated there. So, and I think the other thing that we're definitely you know, concerned about or have an ear toward is inclusive outcomes. So we want to make sure that, of course, you know, our you know, whole ethos as an organization is to close that gap that we have seen that is only growing between prosperous and distressed communities, and of course, and to do so through increased entrepreneurship, among other strategies. So, you know, to that end, we want to ensure that, you know, this program is not only helping the most prosperous communities get to be more prosperous. We want to ensure that, you know, what the goal here is to get more distressed communities, you know, kind of to get out of the recession that they currently find themselves in. And so we think it's really important to work with philanthropies and other nonprofits and other stakeholders here to ensure that these investments do translate into job and opportunities for zone residents themselves. So anyway, that's just something to keep in mind. And, you know, again, just thinking through your own strategies on how to do that. And as David mentioned, like, we are a resource here. If you have any, you know, questions about kind of next steps on how to do that, then please do reach out to us. There are also many partner organizations that we work with who are working specifically with local officials and governments, and as well as economic development organizations to help think through how to incorporate opportunity zones into your economic development plans. CDFA is one that comes to mind. Some of you may be members of that organization. We've worked and partnered quite a bit with them on webinars such as these and other tools and resources that we've created collectively to, again, help prepare your regions for success here. So kind of where are we at currently? So as we mentioned earlier, the zones are certified and the final map is in place. We are hoping to get additional guidance from IRS and Treasury by the end of this year. A lot of people are waiting for additional guidance, and I think, as questions come in, you may hear us say we're still waiting for guidance on Treasury and IRS, particularly around some of the definitional pieces of the statute, as well as some of the key questions around investing into businesses versus real estate. So we're hoping to get a lot of those really critical answers before the end of the year. And it's important to get that early because basically the funds need to start up and start capitalizing before the end of 2019. And that's again because of that 2026 deadline for deferral of the gains. So essentially, if you want to get the full investment, the full 15% in the step up in basis, which only occurs after an investment is held for 7 years, just kind of counting backwards, that's basically 2019. So we need to have the funds stood up and in place and investment to start to flow by next year in order for investors to see the full benefit of the incentive for these investments in these zones. That said, though, I think even beyond that, we'll certainly see these funds starting to scale in 2020 and 2021, reaching that 90% threshold and continuing to deploy funds. And ideally, we're going to be collecting some baseline data here so that we can start to really take a look at where these investments are flowing and the early impact of that in the years to come.
Yeah, I think that's really great. If I can jump in just for one quick second. We are excited to take whatever questions you guys have. And like Catherine said, there was probably a good amount that we will say is going to depend on guidance being released from Treasury. And I think it's easy to see that or perceive that there's a holding pattern on that. But I think that it actually really is buying some time, especially for state and local government officials, to really put together their sort of plan and strategy on how to mobilize around this opportunity. So just because we don't have all of the guidance out to really hit the go button, there is a lot that everyone can be doing to sort of prepare for that. And once that certification form is released and once we get the guidance, there are going to be a lot of people that are ready to hit the ground running. And I think the more that we can do in this sort of pre-period to really develop those strategies and help communities mobilize to present what their investable opportunities are, the better. So that was just a quick note that I wanted to say. There is a lot that we don't know, but there's also enough that we do that this is really the time to be moving on all of that.
Absolutely, and I think the stuff that we don't know, I think impacts, as David mentioned, kind of more impacts the investor community. But for you all, I think there's a lot we do know, and that's namely where are those zones in your own communities, and what is already there, and what is planning to be there. What do you want to be there? And so I think that is the exciting picture that most of the kind of questions about the places and where they are, and kind of what you hope to be there in the future as you kind of look out 10 years from now, that is already designated and that's set. So now is really an exciting opportunity to kind of to get really creative and kind of imagine what could be next. All right, so looking at a few questions here.
Nancy, do you want to moderate these questions, or do you want us just to take questions directly from the chat?
I think because I'm doing some of the technical support in the background, I will go ahead and let Courtney moderate the question and answer as well, and go ahead and be able to, do any closing remarks for the rest of the webinar, but continue to let me know if you have questions or concerns.
Thanks.
So Dave and Catherine, we do have some questions in the chat. As you can see there, the first question is, will there be a clearinghouse or website with O funds where a community can match locations with investors?
That's a great question. I think that's actually a strategy that we are highly encouraging, particularly states and other local governments to create a website like that, where essentially it kind of can help match opportunities in these zones and potential investments with investors that might, have an aligned interest there. Right now, that doesn't exist yet, but again, that is definitely a strategy that we are highly encouraging, particularly state governments, to take a look at and to create with the help of local stakeholders.
Yeah, and I think that's a point on that sort of, given the program's flexibility and the fact that these funds are going to be self-certifying, there is not really going to be a central clearinghouse or a central database where we could say, this is the exhaustive list of opportunity funds that exist. That would be nice, that would be ideal to be able to say that, but given the structure of the program, that's not going to totally be possible. So it really will depend on everyone sort of staying tuned into their local areas, their state, their region, to see where the fund formation is happening. And that's something, of course, obviously, that we are doing our best to be tapped into, and looking at what resources we can put together and provide to do the best job at painting what that landscape looks like. But yeah, just an important note that there really is not going to be one exhaustive list, just because the program isn't structured that way, where people would be having to go through a publicly available listserv of who's certifying.
Well, thank you for that. The next question is, looking at the map, there are many small communities with fewer resources that may not understand the program fully. Do you have a simplified version that could be sent out to local accountants and investors to promote the program, almost like an education packet, if you will?
Sure. So what we can do after this is circulate our fact sheet that has basically a lot of the elements of this presentation, particularly around opportunity zones and how they work, all kind of laid out, and it actually kind of nicely shows a chart of the potential power of the investment as well, and the incentive. So we can certainly send that out. I think that when investors and accountants kind of see that, it could be a helpful tool for them to help to get to know the program more generally. And we can also look through our resources. I would just generally refer you to our resources page in opportunity zones. So it's just eig.org/opportunity zones. And there is a resources page there that has not only resources that we've developed, but ones that our partner organizations have also developed, and that are updated in real time. So would definitely encourage you to kind of take a look there. There's also some FAQs, which could be really helpful. We've tried to kind of distill the most frequently vexing questions and provide answers to them there.
And I'll add, webinars such as this is aimed at trying to spread education, both for large and small communities. So
absolutely, yeah.
The next question is, with real estate development being so speculative, there is concern that a project may be unsuccessful. If a community has a publicly owned site, could an O fund be established for that specific project? Then investors put in to raise a pile of equity that can leverage financing for, say, an apartment project. And when do they get their payoff?
Yeah, okay, so let's look through that. Okay. So in terms of O fund structure, you could do single asset funds or you could do multi-asset funds. I'm looking at if there's potential for,
I mean, one caveat for certain is that the publicly owned site would need to be in an opportunity zone.
Right.
So that's obviously the number one kind of qualification.
Right, and for an equity investment, presumably they would be taking on some ownership of that site, right? And they would have to be purchasing that property. There would be some exchange of ownership for that equity. And so that's,
yeah, on its face, it seems like it's possible. The only thing that that may be an issue is the publicly owned piece of it, I feel like.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that would trigger a conflict of interest, but in terms of when they get their payoff, obviously that really depends on the market. So yeah, when it would work the same as any other fund. Whenever they can exit it, they would exit it. And the idea with this program, of course, is to hold that investment for 10 years so that any of the gains from that investment would be permanently exempt from paying capital gains tax. But yeah, that would really, in terms of timeline, that really is market driven. Yes.
Jonathan, if that doesn't answer your question, you want to offer a little clarification, please just jump in.
Yeah, I just unmuted. I think the goal would be for a way to use this as a tool for communities that maybe have acquired property through condemnation proceedings or something along those lines to really sweeten the deal for a prospect to maybe purchase that publicly owned property and then turn it into a meaningful development in it. Our opportunity zone, like Olney's, is in our downtown area, and there are a lot of locations there that could benefit from this kind of funding. We see apartment complexes and nightlife establishments as probably the main opportunity to really get a downtown kicked off, and then you can see retail follow after that. But it's such a challenge in a lot of rural downtowns to really make a go of it as a small business that you need something like this. So.
Yeah, and hopefully that works for exactly that. This should be driving incentive for people to invest into those areas. And I think sort of in that broad outline that should work, and that would be exactly in line with what this program is aimed to do.
Super, thank you.
The next question deals with human capital, and that what human capital is necessary to help access the program or the funds, such as specific tasks or partnering organizations.
So I think, and please, to whomever asked the question, jump in if this doesn't get to what you're asking. But I think in terms of people or service kind of providers that would be helpful to activate as you are getting to better understand this program. I mean, certainly we work with a lot of kind of public accountant firms as well as tax lawyers, and they are particularly those two types of professional services kind of organizations are the ones that are really leading the way in helping everyone, including us, interpret the statute correctly and better understand the program, as well as what we do know, and then understanding the questions that we still need to answer as well. So I don't know if that is exactly the answer that you're looking for, but I think the other thing, just kind of more broadly, in terms of like just human capital and getting this program off the ground in your communities too. I mean, one strategy, and this might be a little bit outside of the scope of the question, but one strategy that we do encourage, again, states and to some extent, where this is possible, regional and local governments, is to identify an opportunity fund or opportunity zones point person to really help facilitate kind of some of the questions and to put together kind of an investment prospectus, so to speak, to ensure that investment does come into the communities that you are aiming to get that investment into. So I don't know if that answers that question, but and please feel free to chime in if you want to expand further or go a different direction.
Okay, well, we do have some additional questions, and we'll get to them. But real quick, if the participants in today's webinar can assist us, and a little feedback, a little polling in the chat box, if you will put a 1 through 5, a number 1 being the no knowledge at all, and number 5 being most knowledgeable, on how much do you feel you've learned today around this subject, opportunity zones, and how much knowledge you feel you have gained on today's topic would be very helpful. And we'll continue with the questions. Our next question deals with Jess, coordinator to the layer map with our enterprise zone, TIF, and opportunity zones. This person said they couldn't find specific coordinates of the opportunity zones so that they could layer it over their GIS system. How do we, or where do we get this information? Are these zones layer over specific census tracts? Is that correct?
They are, yeah. So it looks like that question came from Valerie. If you want to email me after this at david@eig.org, I can follow up with you on where you can pull those files down. But it's mapped to census tracts, and those data files are available from census. But because we've had so many people ask that, I can easily forward you that email on that shows exactly where you can pull those files down.
Is the exemption tax benefit, the no tax on gains for 10+ years investments, available to any sort of capital infusion, or is it only available to previously unrealized capital gains that have been put into the O funds?
Yeah, we get this one too a lot. That would be really nice if it were available to all sorts of capital investment, but it is all the incentives, including the permanent exclusion for investments held 10+ years, are only applicable to investments made with capital gains.
Are municipal infrastructure projects such as water and sewer improvements eligible for investment?
So that's an interesting specific use case. I would say, just trying to think through what the requirements are for investment, it would have to be 90% of the assets are within an opportunity zone. So that's usually where some infrastructure projects run into an issue where they sort of expand beyond just the single census tracts that are opportunity zones. So that would be something to pay attention to. And again, just paying attention to the fact that equity investment would require some exchange of ownership. So I don't know if that always works for public owned entities or projects like that, where the government may not be wanting to give up ownership of some of those assets to a private sector fund. Those would be the notes off the top of my head for that.
Dana, does that answer your question? If not, just please unmute yourself and jump in and add a little more clarification. Okay. Are investors in O funds anonymous?
So because there's no public facing database that would say what the O funds are and who are their members, that's all going to be in your tax filings. It'll be a self-certification form if you are creating an O fund. So that would be something within your own fund creation, origination documents that wouldn't be dictated by the statute.
And then we have a question about the opportunity zone maps and opportunity zones, that if our community is not listed on the map, are we exempt from this program?
Yeah, so the opportunity zones map was, or the opportunity zones that were designated, which essentially shows the opportunity zones that were designated. The way that they were designated were by the governors of each state, or in the case of DC, the mayor. But anyway, the state executive essentially worked with, their staffs, local development organizations as well, kind of run the gamut across all 50 states in terms of their process. But they essentially designated 25% of low-income census tracts to be eligible, or to be opportunity zones, and therefore be eligible for this type of investment. So if your community is not listed on the map as an opportunity zone, then unfortunately it is not eligible for the investments that we've been discussing in this webinar today. The map essentially just shows what designations were picked essentially by governors and then designated and certified by Department of Treasury after that.
Yes, the map is exhaustive, and if you want to check on the CDFI website, they have an Excel file publicly available that lists all of the census tracts that were designated, and so that's what that map is created off of. But yes, it is exhaustive.
Yeah. And those designations are in place for 10 years at least, and then until kind of recertification essentially. So.
All right, and we don't have any other questions currently. We are reaching the end of our hour. We want to thank you all for participating in today's webinar. As a reminder, a video recording of today's webinar will be available on the U of I Extension's Local Government Education Archives. Within 2 to 3 business days, this video will be up there. And a follow-up email will be sent out with handouts, slides, and the information to access this recording. Thank you all for participating, and a huge thanks to David and Catherine. Much appreciated. Hope everybody has a good